Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look for ways we can work together to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today, we have with us Dr. Daryl Crouch. He's the executive director of Everyone's Wilson. So you could go to everyone'swilson.org unless you're driving down the highway. Don't do that at this particular time. But Daryl has spent a lot of time. He spent more than 28 years pastoring in churches. And then he went and developed this ministry called Everyone's Wilson, which we want to talk about today. So, Daryl, first of all, welcome to the Better Together podcast, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Eddie, it's just a great honor to be with you. It's so exciting to hear people talk about working together in a season of our culture that a lot of people don't like to work together. So, having a Better Together podcast is what a treat.
Well, you've been modeling this for quite a while, my friend. You've been bringing people that are different together and trying to help people learn how we can be the hands and feet of Jesus. Let's just start out by investigating, just share with our audience, how is it that you came to this ministry, to do this ministry, Everyone's Wilson?
Like you said, I pastored churches for 28 years, and my last full-time ministry role was pastoring Green Hill Church in Mount Juliet, Tennessee. We're just 20 minutes due east of Nashville, and we began to ask some different questions while I was there. What does a healthy church look like? What does real kingdom impact look like for the local church? And so we began to ask some different questions, not just how our church is doing, but how's our community doing? And when you start to expand the scorecard a little bit and think outside of your own internal metrics, you begin to ask different questions and structure your thinking and behavior a little bit differently. And certainly those internal metrics are important: attendance and baptisms and so on, super important. But they're critical to the extent that they help mobilize God's people into the actual mission field that's around them, or actually to their neighbors and their community. And so we took a little broader approach, and we began to step into Jeremiah 29 and some other passages in the scripture to say God's people should care about people that aren't God's people just yet. Like loving our neighbors means something, and it should be more than sentimentality. Jesus asked blind Bartimaeus, "Hey, what do you want?"
Mm-hmm.
And Bartimaeus didn't say, "Hey, I want to be saved and follow you and start a seminary," or he said, "I want to see." And Jesus accommodated that, healed him, and we believe also transformed his life and moved him from death to life and by faith. And so I think caring about the things that people care about should become very important to us, and not as a bait and switch. I'll give you a box of food if you'll come to my church, but I love you as an image bearer of the Most High God. I care about your welfare, and I care about the condition of my community. And what we found was that when we stepped in and started caring about what our police officers cared about, what our educators cared about, what our everyday Joe and Jill neighbor care about, when we started caring about the things they care about, then it becomes fertile soil for the gospel. And the church at large, the Big C church, churches of different denominations or whatnot, began to have more traction with local leaders and more opportunities to be platformed at the chambers of commerce, more doors open to them for gospel proclamation and influence. And so we think when we care for our neighbors, God honors that and then allowing us to share with them, and through modeling and by proclamation and witness.
So you kind of were bent this way a little bit. I know you've got a heart for hurting churches, and so you had pastored but really we're almost getting to 3 decades of ministry, and you start thinking a bit differently, thinking about Jeremiah 29, build, plant, have children, and then seek the peace of the city and pray for the city where you're in.
Yeah.
That kind of got you down this road, and I hear you talking about schools and law enforcement agencies. And I know a lot of our listeners may say, well, that sounds like a bunch of woke stuff and so forth, but you're pulling it from Jeremiah 29 and Matthew 25. And it sounds like you're even saying that's what the early church did, and even Jesus did when he helped blind people and so forth. And so it really is the gospel at work, isn't it?
It really is. And you mentioned we could go a lot of different directions, Eddie, on this, but you mentioned Matthew 25. Jesus said, as you do unto the least of these, my brethren, so you do to me. He self-identified with the most vulnerable among us. He said, if you're, this is the way you treat them is the way you treat me. So it obviously it's not transactional, but it was very important to him to emphasize how important the folks that are living in the margins are. The other factor that was really motivating to us is that in my state, which was formerly a Bible Belt state, my community, formerly a Bible Belt community, 80% of my neighbors are not connected to Christ or a church. 80%. And so the lostness that is so profound brings on also profound brokenness in the family unit. Moms and dads don't stay together. Husbands and wives don't stay together. That creates all kinds of brokenness, mental health challenges, loneliness, education delays, and all the rest. All the social things that we think about are brought on by the profound spiritual lostness where our neighbors are not in a relationship with God. And so I think we have to care for everybody as a whole person. And certainly wokeism is kind of popular, but the gospel's never been more alive. And Jesus has never cared more for our neighbors than he does right now. And so we're simply asking people to move from their, and we talk this language some, our bubble, our own personal bubble, and move into the space where people who are that 80% are not coming to our churches. You can put a circus out on the front lawn, you can have a concert, and all that fun is good, and it's a blessing to a lot of people, but that's not what's going to reach the 80%. It's about God's people being engaged and caring well for our neighbors, and making disciples in every corner or domain of our communities that make that happen.
And so that led you to work with others to develop Everyone's Wilson. And you can see that at everyone'swilson.org. Tell me how these believers come together to try to meet the needs of Wilson County in the state of Tennessee, because I think a lot of our listeners may hear this and think, we might be able to do something like that to engage in our community. It may not be that 80% of our community is not believers, but it's probably some of our listeners, they will be in that situation. And if not, they'll be more up in the 50s or 60s, I suspect.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would commend any of our listeners. You care about your community, you love God, you're called to live on mission with Jesus. This is a worthy endeavor. So our mission really is to unite the church, to engage the community so everyone can thrive. And to unite the church, we know that Jesus-loving people, not every church is for everybody. My church is not the best church. It's the best church for me. So we kind of break down the walls that divide us. And Jesus-loving, Bible-preaching, gospel-preaching churches can come together, say, listen, we're gonna be local churches, but there's a few things that we can do together. John 17, Jesus prayed that we would be one, so as the Father and the Son are one, so that the world would know that the Father sent the Son. And so I think our unity becomes a compelling apologetic. So that begins with pastors really getting together for coffee, prayer, lunch, getting to know each other, learning to like each other, growing to love each other very deeply. We're not competitors. If we are, we're bad at it because most of our neighbors aren't in one of our churches. We need more healthy churches. Every community needs more healthy churches. There's not enough church buildings in my community to reach 80% or 20% or 30% more people. So we need more healthy churches. So removing the competition stigma and beginning to build relationships with pastors. And then when those pastors get to know each other and trust each other, they start to lead their churches to do a few things together. One church cannot do everything that needs to happen in a local school, for example, or in the local law enforcement agency, or in the DCS office, in the foster and adoption sphere, or in any other sphere. One church, no matter how big, or how small, cannot do it all. They have limited capacity, but together we multiply our capacity to flood a school, for example, with Jesus-loving people who will serve those kids and those educators and build relationships with those families that will really make a difference. And so schools, we talk about that a lot because people understand that, but there's lots of ways that churches and Jesus-loving businesses can partner together to enter into the public sphere in all of those pockets of vulnerability that we can talk about. But it's hard work, but it's not complicated. It takes some intentionality. It takes a commitment to say, the condition of the community is just as important as the statistics in my church and how my church is doing. And so when we begin to love our neighbors, we begin to remove barriers for our churches to work together to do some great things. And it becomes a testimony. It's not just fun, but it is fun to see non-believing public officials, public sector leaders start to take notice that these churches are working together to do some really important things that these public sector workers are really working hard to fix. So what happens, just real briefly, is that the church isolates while public sector leaders, government, and other nonprofits are trying to fix profound problems like housing or mental health or poverty or education. And they're kind of doing it in a silo, and the church is off to the side. And a lot of times the church is, I don't know, we wag our finger a little bit. We're a little bit critical. We're a little bit disgruntled or frustrated with the condition of things, but we're actually not personally engaged. And so this gives us a chance to get into the mix with public sector leaders and help them be successful in their space. And God honors that.
So if we think about it, really what you're saying is it's a way to be a testimony to those particular individuals. It's kind of where Jesus said, by their unity, they'll see Christ's love in John 17 there. So I think you're saying there's a lot of problems out there. The public sector is often trying to deal with them. Sometimes they don't know how, or they're just incapable of it.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you're saying they would welcome the church's help if we would be willing to come along or to provide some assistance to them. What are some ways churches can do that? I heard you say it's first off trying to get involved with other churches, and they can go to your website and see what you consider or what we consider biblically to be a real church, thinking
Right.
about the basics of the Christian faith, if you will.
Right.
But we've got those things in common. How do we go from there?
Yeah, so much of it. I appreciate that. It's very exciting to watch this play out in a local community. But when a pastor begins to, step in, or a group of pastors begin to step in and invite public sector leaders into their life, let's have lunch. Let's have coffee. Can I come to your office? Rather than you come into my office, can I come to your office and ask you some questions about your work, about the biggest challenges? In our early beginnings, before we were anything, before we were a thing, we invited all the public sector leaders to the local chamber of commerce, and we just asked them if we had a magic wand, which, theologically we don't believe in that. But anyway, if we had some sort of ability to wave a wand and fix any problem in our community, what would that be? And we just asked them, what are the biggest challenges that our neighbors in this community face? And so they had, in the course of two meetings and some survey work, we didn't know what we were doing very much then. We can help a community to do a little better than we did back then. But we identified 4 pockets of vulnerability, and so that came from them. That's not something the church said, hey, this is stuff you need to fix. They said to us, here's our biggest challenges. Can you help us? And any public sector leader that, I shouldn't say any, but just about any public sector leader is going to welcome the help if it's done well, if we honor their policies and honor their, they've got constituents and things to manage, and safety protocols and privacy issues and all the things. But if we will honor them, they will open the doors to the church. I laugh, not really out loud, but I laugh when I hear people talk about schools not letting the church in or whatever. That's just because you haven't tried hard enough. You've been ugly or condescending or demanding or entitled. If you go in with open hands and with a willingness to wash feet, figuratively and maybe literally, but to be a servant to those educators in this case, or to law enforcement, first responders, or mental health professionals, or DCS workers. If we go in to serve, it's going to be rare that you find somebody that doesn't welcome that, and they are over challenged. And we would say, from a theological perspective, they do lack some resources, some very important resources in actually solving the problems they're trying to solve. And we bring the hope of the gospel. And there's ways to share that, and when we share it, when we don't. But the being salt and light opens the door for God to do a great work through us. And so when we have open hands and a servant's heart, God does some great things.
No, that's great. And so Paul told us, pray for everyone. He's talking about the leaders of
Right.
his day, Nero and so forth. So I think I hear you saying, hey, pray for these folks that are in difficult positions. Maybe even send them a note or a letter and let them know. But also here, I will go to you. Could I come into your office and just listen to them, be a sounding board, if you will, hear about the problems that they talk about? And I think what you're saying is often they're just overwhelmed. There's so much that's happening. You talk a lot about Department of Social Services. We think about foster care. We think about all of the elements there. We think about the mental health crisis and the addiction crisis with fentanyl in the country. So what do we do about that? And so they'll let us help. It's what you've experienced. And you mentioned schools, you mentioned law enforcement, and you mentioned a lot about DSS or whatever it's called, wherever you would be, Department of Social Services that deal with that area. There's opportunities for that. So it sounds though like that would be some hard nuts and bolts stuff, though, eventually. Do we need a skill set as a church or as individual Christians as we're trying to respond to some of these needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it begins with a posture. It begins with the posture of our heart that we are local missionaries, that we are not trying to reinvent new things. I think sometimes pastors feel overwhelmed as well, and church leaders. And so if any of those are listening, they're thinking, man, I don't need one more thing.
Mm-mm.
Our only goal is to help the church be what God has called the church to be, and what most pastors and church leaders want the church to be in their community. We want to remove friction, remove barriers to help mobilize Jesus-loving people into the public space with intentionality and effect. And so a lot of it's just a posture that, hey, this is our community and we care about the nations. We're going to partner with mission organizations in Africa and South America and all the rest. We're going to do that. But we're also going to be in a posture as a local minister of the gospel, an ambassador for Christ right here where we live. So first it's a posture. And then there are skills and systems that are important. And I think the Lord's used the last few years in our life and ministry to help us develop some of those. And we're in the process. We'll begin to we have them. It's just a matter of getting them platformed in the right way on our website. But sometimes public sector leaders and offices and departments and organizations, that's the word I was looking for, are not really ready to receive the help they're asking for. And so they don't have systems to receive help. For example, schools don't always have a system to receive non-educator adults into the building during the day, right? And
Mm.
so there's some challenges to overcome. And so we have training for that. We have systems for that to not only help the church that's wanting to engage and the business partners, but to help the principals know here's the way this can work in your community. And so we have some of those resources available. And so sometimes it's about building a system. And when I say system, I'm not talking about an elaborate system. It could be a QR code and a table in the foyer of your church. It could be you have a foster day where you preach on orphans and widows, and then you have clear next steps for your people. So it's not an elaborate system, but it's an intentionality. And then in terms of skill, there are some trainings that are important along the way. You've been in the mental health space, so you understand trauma-informed care and just being aware. We're not trying to create psychologists or psychiatrists, but just some of us that haven't been in this space, and I'm one of those up until a few years ago. I just didn't understand that that a father may not come to the front door when I'm delivering groceries
Hmm.
to his children, not because he's mean or ungrateful. He's just embarrassed
Yeah.
and he is struggling. So I think sometimes those of us who are trying to do good have a certain kind of mental framework that doesn't assume the best. And so I think some of those trauma-informed care or mental health first aid trainings can just create awareness of what might be going on in the lives of those that we're trying to help. And so those trainings are available, and we can help people in their area connect with those. But sometimes there's a pastors feel overwhelmed if they start to hear a podcast like this, like, gosh, trying to do so many things. But so we want to remove the overwhelm if
Yeah.
that's possible and say, listen, just start where you are. And if you have a volunteer who's passionate about a particular area, or if you've met with your local leaders and they say, hey, if you could do one thing, do this, then we begin to bring pastors and churches around that one thing, get traction in that one thing before we try to go off and, fix everything. And so there's a process to it that's not super complicated, but we have found that it is important, and if you ignore it, it becomes just unmanageable. So we'd be honored to help any pastor or group take their step into all that.
So if you're listening in, we really encourage you take a look at the website, everyone'swilson.org. A lot of resources there. And as Daryl's saying, there's more resources coming. Daryl, we've had a lot of churches that partner with Child Evangelism Fellowship and do good news clubs and schools and backyard Bible schools and such. And some folks partner with First Priority, which seems to be a little bit older kids and so forth. And then I think, we do something called First Aid Ready for churches. And so, especially trying to help them deal with people that are widowed and divorced and that are recently traumatized and so forth. So, like you say, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I notice a lot of times in churches that are doing these things, there's often people already there that want to do that. And then when they become involved in it, it's almost like, you just poured gasoline on them and they just take off, and they'll often do that. It's a way of them using their spiritual gifts, if you will. So
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying. Pastors are thinking, and even lay people, oh no, another thing. It can just be part of the bigger part, but we are thinking conceptually about, hey, I need to try to help law enforcement, or I need to try to help my community, and I'm doing that. I'm being the hands and feet of Christ.
Yeah.
Wonderful ministry, my friend. I just thank you so much for taking the time to spend this with us and explain it a little bit for us today. And thank you for how you're so helpful with sharing your resources to so many of our churches and so many of our communities. We should point out there's also you've got one of these in the northeastern part of Tennessee, around Kingsport, right? Is it Rowan County?
Kingston in Roane County. It's just west of Knoxville, and so that's our first new expansion, or as we scale to other counties and communities. So it's called Roan for All, and you can see that on our website too. It's just a landing page for them right now, but we are rolling out. We will roll out other resources and ways to help. It's taken us, I don't know, 5 to 6 years. It shouldn't take that long if we flatten the learning curve out a little bit. So we've paid the dumb tax for a lot of folks, and so we're excited about that. But the best thing, I think, if you do go to our website, that obnoxious pop-up for to subscribe to our email will come up. As obnoxious as that is, that would be the best. That would be a great way to see week to week. I send a weekly email, usually weekly, sometimes every 2 weeks, but usually a weekly email. And that way the subscribers will and listeners will be able to see when we start to roll out our new website and the toolkits and toolboxes that we roll out for folks as well. So they can contact us at the website and we'd be happy to get on a phone call, or they can subscribe to the email and stay updated as we continue to roll some things out in the next 2 months, really.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you, Daryl. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. And there's so much more on the website. So be sure to go to everyoneswilson.org. That's everyone, and then the word, then S, everyone's, and then wilson.org. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, my friend.
Hey, God bless you. Thanks. It's been just a real treat.
And we want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I'm sure you know someone that could benefit from this podcast. Please take it. Please share it with them. Remember, every little thing we do, it really does matter. And remember, we accomplish so much more when we work together. We're better together. Thank you for joining us today.